welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are be discussing the rumors between the Big 12 and UConn regarding a possible UConn joining the Big 12. Now, for a while now, there's always been constant realignment and rumors regarding particularly the Big 12 and the ACC have probably been the two conferences that have really been the most aggressive in terms of trying to add more teams. Now, with that said, there were some reports early July, somewhere in that sort of window where there were rumors that UConn did have some meetings with the Big 12, and ultimately it was announced today that wouldn't be going through. And I figured at least with that kind of news, at least to share a little, some thoughts and analysis on what that move could possibly mean. And particularly since this show is generally within a football lens, talking about it within that sort of scope. Now, if we're talking about the school just broadly, obviously, they're coming off back-to-back national titles in college basketball. They were able to keep Dan Hurley from going away from the Los Angeles Lakers. They have been trying to build up their football program, as of late. They have tried to upgrade some facilities. Jim Mora, who's going into his third year, is the head coach over there. Who by the way, I don't think ever really gets enough credit for the type of job he's done over there. Now I get they were 3-9 last year, and they were 6-7 and made it to a bowl game for the first time since 2015, back in 2022. And also, a lot of people don't realize that when he was in Atlanta Falcons, yeah, he was young, and he never should have said that he would take the University of Washington job while the coach of the Atlanta Falcons and possibly making the playoffs, which was obviously, I think he would admit to, was pretty silly and idiotic and all those things under the sun. But I think what we've seen from Jim Mora, I think he's a lot more poised, he's a lot wiser, and when I've heard him in interviews and when ESPN did a big piece on him last year, I think it really goes to show that he is a guy, the perfect kind of guy for that program too. Especially, he had a bunch of years at UCLA. He was a Seattle Seahawks coach for a season. So and Connecticut's been pretty consistent with constantly bringing in pretty experienced coaches throughout their, let's just say, the last 20 years. Now, obviously, for the majority of it, it was Randy Insall who coached there for about, he had two stints, kind of similar to Greg Schiano. You have, Paul Castellani as well, who, he coached there from 2011 to 2013. And he was also previously head coach at Syracuse from 93 to 2004. But in any event, I mean, you got to admit too, UConn is a really hard place to win, especially now that they have this independent status too. At one point, back in 2019 and 2020, they were in the AAC. And then obviously with UMass going over to the MAC, it made logical sense that maybe UConn would make that jump too, especially that would make a lot more geographical sense for them to maybe go to the MAC as opposed to going to the Big 12. But at the same time too, UConn's independence isn't really as beneficial as it once was maybe 20 years ago. Because even when you think of, the top independent teams, even back in the day, it was really the academy schools. So you have Army, Navy, who were independent for a while. You had, Temple in the early 2000s who went that route as well. Notre Dame obviously is still going to be an independent because they have all the leverage in the world to stay an independent, and they have the media deals to be able to compensate for that. So there's really no reason for them to really join a conference, as much as I think everybody would love for them to just join the ACC, since in football, they pretty much already have a scheduling agreement with them, just, much in the similar vein as, Oregon State and Washington State does with the Mountain West, who, by the way, they're not doing that anymore. But when I heard Brett Umark's your mark, talk about the reasons why UConn, they ultimately decided to not go through with it. The quote that standed out to me was value creating opportunities. And I think what it really came down to was they sat down. I bet they probably had this meeting and they were like, okay, maybe there's something there, but we'll see what the other teams say. But as you know too, there's now 16 teams, so creating UConn would obviously be 17, and there's obviously a couple year window in there where not too much goes on. But I was pretty shocked when I first heard this begin with, because I don't to me the fit doesn't really make sense from a football perspective. Obviously, if you're talking about regular sports, that's one thing. But I would say more broadly, it really doesn't make sense for really any aspect of it, but particularly football is what I'm going to focus on. I think, I just alluded to it a couple seconds ago, but to me, one of the biggest reasons, obviously, conference, geographically speaking, UConn is over in the Northeast, way, way up in the Northeast compared to some of the other Big 12 teams who are, primarily in the Midwest. So you already have that traveling logistic right there. And, I also, another thing I thought about is, I think one can make the argument that if UConn wasn't an FBS team, I think a lot of people can make the argument that UConn probably does belong in the FCS in terms of college football. And you think about the past couple seasons, they went 3-9 last season. They had that 6-7 season I alluded to before when they made a bowl game. I'm not going to talk about the year. I'm not going to talk about the year of COVID, but in 21-22 they were 1-11. So that was I believe the year before Jim Mora showed up. And then 1920 they were 2-10, which was their last season in the AAC. So with if we're talking about purely from a competitive standpoint, they would by far be the laughing stock of the Big 12. And when you think about these other teams, they would make Baylor look pretty good. They you know they're even in a worse situation than Kansas is, because as you know now, with Lance Leipold being there, they've invested heavily in football now to the point where Kansas is only going to get better from here, and you don't really get that same sort of aspect from UConn. Yes, I think Jim Mora, I think he's one of those coaches that I will always be rooting for, just because I think he's came such a long way from his days as being with the Falcons and being UCLA. He's never going to be that. I don't think he's ever going to be that coach where you're leading to a national title, but he is going to be the type of guys that's going to instill discipline. He's going to be a leader of men, and he's going to be the type of guy that speaks with conviction, has pride, and you really saw that a lot from this team within the past two seasons in general. So I'm not necessarily saying that UConn, I think, to me, a way better fit would be in the MAC, where it geographically makes more sense. You're bringing in UMass anyway, and it'd be a lot more competitive in general, especially from the recruiting aspect, and also NIL to some extent too, because I can't really imagine UConn having the resources to be able to compete with the Kansas States and the Oklahoma States and all these powerhouse schools, compared to them too, because we already talked about the travel logistics of it. The geographics don't make sense. Obviously, 12 out of 16 teams would also have to okay this as well. And I can't really imagine 12 of these teams saying, yeah, we're going to give up part of our revenue for UConn, who is, football speaking, way smaller than us, is not really that relevant in terms of, football in general. They haven't really had a winning program in really many seasons. I mean, obviously Randy Insall did a hell of a job in terms of, you know, getting eyes on the program. And, we definitely remember pretty fondly the days of them being in the Big East too, which is probably the peak of the program at that point. But when you think about that, and you think about the last time they were really in a bowl game was 2015. I think the writing was on the wall in terms of, I think this sounded like a better idea, a hypothetical idea. But when you really sit down and think about it, between, the geographical issues, not wanting to give up the revenues, and also UConn just being on a completely different playing field compared to all the other teams in the Big 12. It's honestly great for everybody that this deal got shot down. And I think in a couple years, we'll probably see UConn either join the either join the MAC, go to the AAC, or they could possibly stay an independent too. But when you have next New Mexico State, who's also not an independent anymore, New Mexico Lobos aren't anymore either. I think the writing's on the wall for UConn to eventually have to decide between one of those two conferences, and hopefully they will, let them in and hopefully make it an even number.